I'm going to start by giving a little bit of context to my work, and I'm going to do a quick little slideshow of some of the work that has interested me in the past, and that I sort of feel like my work fits into in terms of a tradition. So the first half will be looking at quite a number of pieces from other artists. And what I've done is I've created the slideshow not in any sort of thematic or chronological order, but rather I've sort of jumbled all the artists together. So I'll sort of flip through some of the same artists as we go through. And I'll make just sort of, I included quite a few pieces. So if, there may be some pieces that I won't comment on at all, but I'll try to use this as a place to give context. So I'm going to switch over to the slideshow, and let's see if this works here. Of course, it's slower. I don't know why it's all of a sudden doing this slowly.
Well, we've had to learn to be patient with this technology because it's just not as smooth as television, but it's pretty close.
No, that's right. Now, can you still hear me? And can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So you can. So there's these two sculptures. So it's visible, and you can still hear me. I just want to make sure.
Yes.
Good.
Okay. Okay. This is Ugo Rondinon, and I'm probably pronouncing his name incorrectly, contemporary sculptor, and we'll come across some more of his work that I know some people are probably more familiar with. But one of the things about the sculptor's work is the monumental sort of aspect of it, and there is also a sense of something very timeless, and I've always been interested in this. And as Carlin already noted, the interest of sort of the iconography. I mean, that's not the right. That's a loaded word, but iconographic. Let's say there's a sense of singleness that I am interested in presenting with my own work, whether it be pure color or pure shape. Now, what's not interesting, but what I find fascinating is this very fine line of abstraction and figurative work. I've always approached my work coming from the standpoint of figurative work, oddly enough, and I'm always drawn towards figurative work. The work itself and the paintings themselves don't always end up that way, which is fine, and that's part of the process I'm quite interested in. So I'm going to continue on. This is Eduardo Chillida, a Spanish sculptor. Highly formal work. Some more work that some people will be familiar with will come up later in the slideshow. Again, it's playing with the minimalist sort of theme, and sort of the least amount of sort of injection of ideas, I suppose. Trying to get strip it down to what it is that I'm visually that I'm interested in. I think one of the things that I've always struggled with and has always been a hard thing in my work is to show restraint and abstraction obviously, and minimalism obviously is about restraint. And I have a tendency in my work in the past, and I still, it's still a constant thing, is to be overly heavy-handed in my actual production. So that's as when we come to look at the actual work of mine, I'll talk about that as being a major factor as well. So this is Rondinon's work as well. He's interested in looking at these timeless figurative pieces, often using rock. This is Marion Nikl, who I'm sure most of you are familiar with, Canadian artist from out west here, did some work out east, I think, as well. Now, this is interesting because as I've gone further and, just in time, my connection to Canadian art has actually has gotten stronger. And looking at work that was produced, mid-1900s onward, it starts to really resonate with me more and more. And I think obviously living in a place and being born in a place, you start to see why that work actually makes sense and why it's being produced. Her work, although sometimes it's very difficult to actually figure out what it is that makes that work specific to a space or place. But for some reason, Marion Nikl continues to be a source of interest for me. Now, probably most contemporary artists have some connection to Matisse, and it's almost self-evident. Whether you like Matisse or not, the interest in pure color, especially his cutouts, I've always been fascinated to and drawn to. The idea of pureness in terms of color and shape and that hard edge has always appealed to me. And what's interesting, and you'll see it in a few of these other pieces, there's often been a connection to historic religious art. So whether it be found in stained glass windows, which obviously the technical aspect of actually producing stained glass, you're limited to, unless you're painting it, hard lines and a delineation of colors against other colors, which I find very interesting. And of course, the light coming through as opposed to bouncing off of. So this is a good example. This is Gilbert and George, British artist, contemporary British artist, still alive and producing. I've always been drawn to Gilbert and George's work. They've always worked in collaboration. Now their work has this reference to stained glass. They work, if people have not seen their work in real life, it's photographic and it's produced photographically, and it's, I think, first digitally and then photographically and then printed out and framed in these elaborate grid patterns. So again, it's that real sort of contrast in terms of color and graphic nature that I find quite fascinating. This is again Eduardo Chillida, Spanish sculptor. Now, this work I think is some of my favorite that he has done. These were installed along the coastline, and you get this magical silhouette against both the sky and the water, and it's pretty special to be able to actually get that with producing sculpture. You're usually not able to get a blank, well, not a blank, but a pretty interesting, clean backdrop to sculpture, and the formalist nature really is quite beautiful. Peter Doig, contemporary artist, born in Canada, but works overseas. I think I can't remember, Trinidad maybe, where he's working. He's a contemporary artist contemporary painter who he's one of these people that it's hard to know exactly why people love him so much, but he sort of nails the tradition of painting and wraps it all up into these paintings, and deals with a lot of historic and traditional painting subject matter as well, especially from the mid 1800s onward. And his use of color and ease has always drawn me to it. And it's a style of painting that is so foreign to me that I've always found myself drawn to. Agnes Martin, minimalist painter. She's again an artist who I look at that is so mysterious to me that I think deep down when I approach her work, I think I would love to be able to do that work, but it's just not me at all. Which some artists that I look at, that's what I'm really taken with. Yinka Schonenberg is a contemporary artist. I think was part of the Sensation group that came out of London, the young British artists. And apart from the subject matter, which is very important in his work, which deals with colonialism, deals with slavery, deals with a lot of really serious issues. The work is visually just so stunning, and his use of textiles and the use of pure color, again, there's this really interesting connection to, again, the stained glass patterns. You have a lot of references to William Morris and those kind of things, but the ability to use textiles in a way that you don't usually get in terms of its vibrancy, and also the interesting ability to use figurative in a different sort of sculptural level with textiles, that you actually encounter these pieces and you're counting them face to face. Chris O'Feely, actually, who is part of that group as well, the young British artists. Again, similar to Peter Doig, using work, very traditional work that it's actually hard to figure out when this actually could have been painted, and also his thinking about restraint. I look at a painter like this and I think there's such an ease to his actual production, his actual execution, which I admire, and I'm just kind of blown away by. Also, his layering of color, which I'm very interested in, comes through in a very subtle way. Marion Nikl is, again, one of her larger paintings. This is, again, Peter Doig. Again, these very traditional motifs that refer back to people like Gauguin or Degas, Manet, but with this contemporary edge to it that it's kind of hard to resist on my part. Yinka Schonenberg, again, you see this beautiful, use of color, and but again, the textile, which I'm just fascinated by his use of textiles as well. Matisse, self-explanatory. This is Agnes Martin again. Similar to Mark Rothko, there is that spiritual aspect of minimalism that is interesting, spiritual aspect of abstraction that I'm fascinated by, where pieces and because of color or the subtlety they become meditative, and I'm really interested in that quality of it, where color starts to come through from behind, whether it's actually a stained glass or a painting. There's a meditative quality that somehow, I mean, it gets a bit maybe hard to even speak about, but that I do think that, you know, visually does speak to us in a completely different way than other languages do or other parts of our senses can actually receive. Alex Katz, I mean, the graphic nature of Alex Katz is hard to resist for me. There's a lot of references here to even people like Matisse, but Alex Katz, which is more known for his figurative work, but beautiful artist. I think one of my favorite American contemporary artists, painters rather. Partly Alex Katz, again, his use of going into sculptural realms as well, I find fascinating. Using the figure as a way to deal with color, the subtlety of it. There's a quietness that I'm interested in. This is Annie Albers from the Bauhaus. This is Joseph Albers, his partner. When I think they both taught, I think, at the Bauhaus. She was a textile, she took textiles and I think ended up teaching as well. And I've always been interested in, again, it's this textile thing, but interested in her use of patterns. This is Annie Albers again, but this is a painting that was intended for a textiles to be done, or intended for a textile piece. Here again is Gilbert and George, the references to the stained glass and just the vibrancy of color. And again, my interest too in figurative work and how the figure is becomes presented as almost it kind of goes back and forth between a secondary and primary thing that we actually are looking at. This is Peter Doig again. Also, Peter Doig, another thing to mention is his and it's one of these things where it's, I think anytime we all look at art, it's that simplicity that we always sort of admire, that when someone actually nails a composition. And I know composition is such a funny thing because it's such a traditional notion of art, but still there's that formal quality which is always beautiful to see. Walter J. Phillips, Canadian artist. In primarily his woodblock prints, partly that method of printing allows for that color to come through and the layering of color, which again is very important in my work. This is Annie Albers, a textile piece, a weaving. This is Degas, and I think it's Degas. Peter Doig again. As you see, I quite like Peter Doig. Another Peter Doig piece again, but you could be convinced that it was a Gauguin piece as well. This is Joseph Albers, Annie Albers' partner, who is quite famous for, was famous for these squares and interested in color combinations. This is Yinka Schonenbar again. Jack Bush, which is an obvious connection for me. I'll skip through these small pieces. There we go. Walter J. Phillips, the interesting connection to Japanese work, that the traditional woodblock printing. Another one of his. And the color blocking is also a big part of my work that I'm curious. Okay, so this, I included a couple of masks that will pop up because masks are an interest of mine, partly because they do represent an interesting part of who we are in terms of how we present ourselves, but also there's a playfulness in it that when we think about the figure and we think about the portrait, masks to me can open up a whole set of possibilities in terms of even actually painting masks. This seems strange to jump to Renoir, but I included Renoir because as much as I'm not a big fan of Renoir, except when I see Renoir, whenever I see Renoir paintings in real life, I'm really blown away by his use of white and his actual use of white paint, which you don't actually, next time you're at a museum or looking at more sort of historic work, white is a paint that's actually not used a lot. So I'm interested in how white is actually used. And partly the reason, this is Marion Nikl again, and this is a good example, in terms of negative space, or in terms of the space that actually, the paintings that are actually on the other colors, whether it's blue or yellow, but if it's on raw canvas versus if it's on paper, if it's white that's on the background, if it's black, that's a very important part of my work as well. So we're getting through this. This is Agnes Martin again. Eduardo Chillida. Gilbert and George again. Again, that's stained glass. Chris O'Feely, sorry, that's a small one. I'll keep going through. Walter J. Phillips. This is Chris O'Feely, because I'm interested in Chris O'Feely in particular, how he installs work and how it becomes a complete installation. Alex Katz. This is Paul Gauguin. Again, Paul Gauguin. Katz. And that is Jack Bush. So I'll go through this here. This, again, this is in no particular order, but this is now all my work. Now, this piece here, you'll see the connection to this, and I've got to be careful really how I use the word primitive, and I use it very carefully. And probably I'm also using it incorrectly, but I'm going to describe it that way, that this this connection to especially religious iconography or religious symbols or religious objects in how they present themselves sort of as a secondary image. So this work I do, this is work on paper, and basically you think about them as little sketches. So these little masks and objects that you see are cutouts from old books often, and then the colors are painted images, and you'll see more of those as well. This I've included because I was quite interested in how lines, especially lines, thin lines, become marks, as in writing on paintings. And so lines like this and things like marks like this become as if they were sort of drawings or marks, as opposed to, I mean, this is kind of strange, but as opposed to paintings on paintings. So they become as if they were almost an afterthought in terms of writing on a painting. You'll see this too, like the pink line down there. In the top circle here, there's a circle within a circle. That's gold leaf, which I'm also, I like the combination of a gold leaf against raw canvas. And the gray that you see on that is the raw canvas. And I can get into technically how that is actually done in terms of the color layering. So the colors that you see, like the yellow, the blue, the magenta, actually, and the black, are all ink-based acrylics. So really thin acrylics. And so they are laid with a brush on top of prepared raw canvas. So you see the canvas underneath it, and I use a brush with a lot of ink on it, and sometimes it bleeds, sometimes it doesn't. And if it bleeds like too much, it doesn't work. And the problem is that you really only have one chance of actually getting this on here, because I don't like a lot of brush strokes. Now the blue in this particular case, I wanted that as a brush stroke. So if to me, these are very intentional little marks that I'm trying to make. You'll see this, that's a good example as well. Like that blue is, it was produced to get that brush mark. And then these are layered translucent colors for the most part. This is a pretty pure example of these translucent colors against raw canvas. What you don't actually see in this slide very well is the canvas that you see behind the background. Up at the top is raw canvas completely, and then there's a gradation down to white. So what I do is I paint the canvas with a really, really light white paint going into just water. So it's this very subtle white gradation into raw canvas. Again, same sort of thing. Okay, so in terms of these subject matter in terms of also the figurative element, this is probably a good example where you start to see there is a figure there sometimes, but I often think about these yellow suns, but they often start out as heads as well, and you can sort of see these shoulders, and then they evolve into often, I always think about them as almost monumental or monuments types of things. The other thing that starts to occur are, and again, you get this in any sort of minimalist type of work or abstraction, but are narratives in terms of how these things play out. So for me, when I produce work that's horizontal as opposed to vertical, there tends to be more of a narrative to me, and it plays across itself from often left to right as if you're reading it. And there's this narrative of these objects that play against each other. And I mean, the best way for me to even talk about it is the way that you might compose music. I do actually write music as well. I'm not very good at it, but it is the same sort of process in terms of actually painting and putting together a painting. This is one of these paper pieces that I see them as kind of sketches for larger paintings. This is more of a literal sort of mask that this is a paper piece, but this mask image comes up quite a bit. Pretty straightforward. Again, you can see the layering of that color. I mean, this is a pretty literal, oops, sorry, let's go back. I mean, so one of the interests of me in terms of subject matter as well that come up in these, especially these small sketches, are religious themes. Not for any, I mean, definitely I grew up seeing a lot of this type of symbolism, these kind of things. So I usually get it out by actually putting it on on these little paper pieces. It's a less committed way to sort of deal with subject matter and those aesthetics. This is also sort of along the same lines. These are fairly recent pieces where you can see that connection to the mask and that sort of, but they're very playful, and I try to keep them as playful even if they get a little bit serious. Same sort of thing. These are done on panels, so that's why you get that kind of watery bit in the blue, and those are gold leaf circles. Similar sort of thing here. This is a paper piece, but same sort of subject matter. This is a little paper piece as well, and I include a lot of paper pieces because I actually really like works on paper. But these little drawings on top of the paintings, again, refer to that idea of making marks over top of paintings. That's an interest of mine. Similar sort of thing. Now these are a little bit more involved paintings. So what I'm fascinated to is that connection to where it leaves the realm of figurative, and then all of a sudden it jumps into landscape as well. And these also these spaces that are very contained, they very rarely leave the canvas. They're highly intentional strokes, and they do require me to show as much restraint as possible, because if I don't, it wrecks the painting. So this is going back to my comment about me being heavy-handed. When I work with acrylic ink, I can't be heavy-handed. I have one chance, and if I mess it up, the painting gets completely messed up. And if I try to fix it, it usually fails completely. So it's an interesting way to keep myself in check. Similar sort of idea. Going back to Renoir, this is my connection to Renoir with white. This, in terms of a white space being especially in the center, to me is interesting. But white also is I can use in a to me a really powerful way, because I'm using the raw canvas backdrop. So white against it is, to me, such a beautiful. It creates such a beautiful space and a beautiful color combination. Because you get these. This is a good example of it too. Very subtle difference between that canvas background and the white. Similar sort of thing. I'm also very interested in rocks, as you probably saw with some of the other sculptors that I was interested in. I collect a lot of rocks, and they come up as shapes a lot in my work as these. They're figurative to me. They're also monuments as well. This is a little paper piece. Another canvas piece. I guess we'll do it twice. Here's another one. Now, the religious, again, it's always a tricky one with religious connections and religious. I mean, it's part of my history in terms of how I grew up. I grew up going to a church. So, I mean, I was fascinated by all the myths and the things that were depicted. And so to me, it's just there's such a rich tradition in terms of stuff to use. I try to use it sensitively, but I also try to use it playfully as well. And if you have any questions about that, we can talk about that. Because I think one of the interest I have in religious art is the icons, for example, or things that are thought of as pieces that can facilitate worship and those kind of things. Is, you know, to me, it's the same thing as a lot of art can do as well. So to me, there's always been that direct connection. And worship is a very interesting theme. Not what you're worshiping, but the act of worship, I think, is a very curious subject matter. I guess that's complicated, but it's a curious thing for me. And we're back to, I think that might be, oh no, there's a couple more here. Okay, so I think I'm going to end with these two. I think these are circles, and you've seen the circles before, but these circles are a bit different because what they are, they're actually circles that have been cut out from other paintings. So I collect all my paintings, and sometimes I'll do paintings with the intention of cutting them out afterwards. So I'll remove the canvas from the frame and lay it on the ground, and I'll cut circles out of them. And so these segments, and then what I'll mount them, and we'll often go back into them and repaint them. So to me, these are kind of interesting parts of the work. They're extremely formal, in that they're all they are is abstracted forms of another painting. So they're very removed from their original thing. But the idea that they can be fragments, they've always interested me as fragments. What they also the other part that interests me about them is that they can exist with each other very well and with other paintings of mine really well, if that kind of makes sense in terms of informing other parts of the work. I'll just skip that. Let's see. Yeah, we're back to that. And that's about it. And I'll close this. And I'll stop sharing my screen.
Aron, thank you so very much for doing that. I'm going to ask people to turn their cameras back on to give Aron the pleasure of seeing who he's talking with.
It was
Yes.
really great.
I'm going to unmute Millie for her.
Your influences,
Okay, great.
particularly Agnes
Yes.
Martin and Marion Nikl in there. And who else? Well, and I was happy to see so much more of Peter Doig's work. And Walter Phillips, the flatness, the matte quality of those wood block prints. They've that kind of work has all. Who is it? Fitzgerald also did a lot. Those are great, and I can see the connections there with your work. But of course, as a painter, I'm interested. How much masking are you doing? And are some of those long linear forms freehand drawn? Is that what you mean about if it doesn't work, the painting is toast?
Yeah.
I know.
So
I know that.
Yeah. So so on the translucent parts where you see the paint underneath the other paints and the large blocks of color that are translucent, there is no masking. They're put on totally freehand, and you only have, if you've worked with acrylic ink, you don't have much time, because what it also will do is that if you work it in too much over top of another acrylic ink, it will actually pick it up again and start mixing it, even though it's dry. There are some of the more opaque blocks of color I will mask sometimes. And then the lines that you'll see that look like they're drawn, those are usually masked. So what I'll do is I'll paint, or I'll use a masking tape and cut those lines out to get the opaque lines. Does that sort of make sense?
Yes. I was thinking in particular of a couple of works that have very long, look like done with a wide brush, fairly long, and wondering how you keep, I've never worked with acrylic ink, how you can keep that continuous for long distance.
Those ones are freehand, and the beauty of acrylic ink is that it does go on so smoothly that it just sort of pours into itself perfectly. And similar to watercolor, unless the place that it's hitting is wet, it'll stay within its borders that you've originally done. And so sometimes I have to go over that piece maybe twice, but I have to do it very carefully. But essentially, I have one chance with one brush to do it. And but it really is, it just goes on so smooth and easy that it's actually quite nice. So, yeah. And actually one other.
Elise, you were.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Aaron.
Okay. Just one other comment about Walter J. Phillips, and how you mentioned how flat his work is. And to me, the flatness is a really good point. I'm so interested in that flat quality of what he can do, and that type of work, and also the acrylic ink. No matter how many times you layer that stuff on, it is totally flat. There are no raised edges, which I think is kind of fascinating.
Thank you.
Elise, Sheriff, you can turn your mic on. You're raising a couple of interesting comments and points about what you've just heard too. Go ahead.
Yeah. Hello, Aaron. It's a pleasure meeting you. I've been looking at your work, and I really appreciate the dexterity and the concentration. I mean, I can really feel on how careful you are and how restricted you are and how disciplined you are in the application of the paint. I wanted to ask a quick question in addition to Millie's comments. Do you use a real brush or do you use sponges?
I use a brush. I actually have never tried sponges. The brushes I use are I have this really nice big floor brush that's for staining floors. And what's nice is that it really holds a lot of ink, so I can do very large areas with it. Mm-hmm. And then on the smaller pieces, I use a very small, fine haired brush. But so far, that to me works quite well. The problem with the anything else is because it's going over top of that canvas, it's pretty rough. It needs something that slides over top of the roughness as opposed to getting bunched up.
It sounds like you're using the perfect tool. That's great. Yeah.
So far it's okay.
So, Carlin, thank you for. So I left a message in the chat room because I really appreciate the connection you find, with religious artifacts, and you look at them by the sound of it beyond their initial context. And I don't know if you saw the chat, but I wrote, isn't it great how religions have a way to find spirited and not spiritual visual expressions in art? I like the difference between spirited as opposed to spiritual. So that kind of detaches it, makes it abstract, and creates a world of its own. I personally have my own approach that way, but I really could see your connection on how you're applying yourself, and great.
And actually, I really appreciate actually how you worded that it's a spirited approach. That's really good. And then also how it's abstracted. I think that's exactly the point.
Mm-hmm. Well done. Thank you.
Thank you.
No, I think there was something interesting though about that connection to the religious art often tended to be either a point of contemplation, which I guess you're referencing through Agnes Martin and others, the kind of Rothko-esque point of focus that takes you out of the concerns of daily life. And then there was, I guess, alternatively, this other stream of representational work that was really creating a narrative hook for memory for people who were perhaps not literate. And so, they were literate in a visual language as opposed to a textual language. And I think you've danced between those two things back and forth in a very interesting way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. That I always, you probably heard this quote, and it's one of my favorite quotes of Steve Martin, who is quite a big art collector, contemporary art collector. And I think he was asked about talking about art, and he said, talking about painting is like dancing about architecture. And sort of this idea that you have, these are different languages, so it's very difficult to actually to come up with the right words.
But you're doing a pretty good job of it. Millie, you're trying to say something, but you're muted.
There, okay. I really love the fact that you chose the islands, Agnes Martin's group of paintings, the islands. I first saw them in the Pace Gallery as an
wow.
in, what was it, 1988, something like that. Anyway, the kind of work that I was doing in the 80s, if you have any idea about that, and one's behind Carlin, was totally going down a different path, much more visceral, gestural work. And but I fell in love with Agnes Martin, and at the time that I thought I couldn't do that kind of work, well, famous last words, I did veer in her direction quite seriously. So that was wonderful to see.
I think my question was answered as we spoke. Thanks for your presentation, Aron. It's Anika. I guess I haven't played with the acrylic inks yet. So it's a medium that I probably will start playing with now that I've seen what you've done with it. It looks really interesting. So thank you. You've kind of piqued my interest.
Oh, good.
Thank you.
Well, they're very. The beautiful thing about them is that the color is so vibrant.
And you can use canvas or paper or anything.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'll definitely give it a shot.
Good. I'm excited.
Well, Aron, I just want to say thank you on behalf of us all, but we can have a little screen applause to thank you for putting the time and sharing with us about your work. Most appreciated.